We are entering a period of polling civil war right now because it looks like there are two very diverging trends in Canadian federal polling right now. Some showing that the Liberals are having a major surge, and others showing that the Liberals are still as dead as a doornail right now. I want to break it down for you today, tell you what I think is credible, what I think is not credible at all, what I think might actually be flat out manipulation. But I'll just get right into it and not belabor this too much. We'll start out with the Main Street Research poll. They recently released data on specifically Ontario only. They were doing an Ontario provincial election poll and they slipped in a question about how people would be voting federally. And it actually showed that the Liberals would be leading the Conservatives by 2 points when undecideds are still included. It's 36% for the Liberals, 34% for the Conservatives, 11 for the NDP, 4 for the Greens, 2 for the PPC, 2 for other, and of course 11% undecided. Now, I actually like Main Street polling. I'm just going to say that out front. I'm not going to be one of these people like, oh, it didn't show the Conservatives ahead. I don't like this pollster. Main Street has done some good work. They were actually really accurate in BC. Yes, technically their popular vote metric was a bit off, but it was hard to tell where the votes were going to be coming from for each of the parties in the regions because everything was in flux. Main Street, in fact, was the one pollster that actually showed how tight the election was going to be in terms of the seat count. All the other pollsters basically projected the NDP getting like 53 to 55 seats. Main Street basically showed it to be like a tie, and it basically ended as a tie. Right now, the NDP only has 47 seats, and they may only have 46 seats after a court challenge. So, again, don't discount what they say right away. But a few notes right off the bat when I see something like this, then I'm going to show you the data table and one of their polls from 10 days ago. Because the thing I immediately am concerned by is how accurate a poll is going to be when you've been asked questions about Doug Ford and the PCs in Ontario, and then suddenly a poll question is slipped in about the federal party. Because the problem is, people have very negative attitudes towards Doug Ford. It's like if I kept asking you questions in Canada. Obviously, you guys are probably going to like Donald Trump more than the average Canadian on my channel. But if I asked Canadians question after question about Donald Trump and about Kamala Harris, and I labeled one a more conservative person and one the more liberal person, then I ask you a federal polling question, you're probably more likely than if you're the average Canadian to say, "Oh, liberal," because I've just been asking you about conservative Donald Trump, and then I start asking you about conservative Pierre Poilievre and liberal whoever the leader is going to be. That might actually boost you up. That's just my conjecture, but let's look at the data table here. We'll just scroll down. I pay for Main Street, and you're not supposed to like release all of their data, and I'm not trying to do that here. I'm just going to show certain things I feel like I need to talk about, and then I will leave it there. But the Conservatives in this poll, even though they're 2 points behind, are actually still leading in 3 of the age brackets. Granted, they're only leading by a decimal point in the 50 to 64 age bracket, but they're still leading with all other Canadians. The one group that's really putting them behind in this provincial poll is 65 plus Canadians, where the Liberals, with basically just a new leader as the leader option, because with the Conservatives, as Conservatives Poilievre, and it says NDP Singh. It says Green May. But with Liberals, it just says Liberals new leader. I'm wondering if that lets people who, especially are older, just think, well, Chrétien was good. Well, Paul Martin wasn't too bad. And they get to imagine the best possible Liberal leader. And then they will then vote Liberal, assuming that it's going to be someone good, when it's probably going to be Mark Carney or Chrystia Freeland, who don't exactly inspire a lot of excitement. Is Mark Carney like a flamingly terrible candidate in terms of being like embarrassing? No, but he's boring like Michael Ignatieff was. Michael Ignatieff was not an embarrassing candidate, he was boring, and that was the big problem. But this kind of like throws me off a bit. Liberals at 43.3%, conservatives at 30.7%. I've been seeing poll after poll, including from Main Street, for a long time, showing that not only were the Conservatives leading with every demographic group outside of Quebec, including older voters, and they were winning by a wide margin. But the thing is that this was also happening just a month ago. It was coming from Main Street. Here is Another poll right here. Oh, that's the wrong one. I have this one right here. This one from literally 10 days ago from Main Street with the same sample size for Ontario shows that, and I might have to go into age groups, but they had an unweighted frequency of 943 people polled. They weighted it down to 913 because it's a little bit of an overpoll for Ontario for the amount of people who picked up the phone. But 943 responses. Liberals got 27.4, Conservatives got 39.1, and the NDP got 13.1. That feels like it's like that doesn't feel exactly realistic to me that the Conservatives in 10 days would bleed off 3 or 4 points, the NDP would bleed off a few more points, and then a bunch of undecideds would get behind the Liberals. It seems a bit odd to me that this would be how fast a poll would change. I think that, and I think it's a pure, like a perfectly rational thing to assume that the polling has just simply been thrown off a bit by the fact that they were asking about Doug Ford first, who is one of the most unpopular premiers in the entire country right now. But then I just want to quickly jump over to Ecos. Ecos is the other pollster right now showing that the Liberals are potentially going to come into the lead nationally, that they're only like 7 points down from the Conservatives. This one is 9, but I think that Frank Graves is releasing a new one that he hasn't put out the details for that are showing that the Liberals are supposedly only down by 5 points now. I just don't believe it. So here's the top line numbers for his January 18th poll. It shows 39% Conservative, 30% Liberal, NDP 16, Bloc 7, all this stuff. But in Atlantic Canada, he has the Greens at 13%. Like, I immediately don't believe you when you have Greens at 13% and somehow the Conservatives are at 31% when so many other pollsters show them leading massively. Like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, that looks good. But if the Liberals were surging, this is the thing that throws me off. Man, if the Liberals were surging, why wouldn't they be surging in British Columbia? But they're surging in Ontario, and they're surging in Atlantic Canada, and they're back in second in Quebec. But BC, nah, I don't want to vote Liberal. I'll keep voting Conservative. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. When polling numbers just stop feeling like they're connected to reality, like a voter in Atlantic Canada and BC, if anything, are kind of similar type voters. They don't really vote NDP in the Maritimes, but you kind of get the same sort of granola liberal voter who doesn't like the Conservatives. Why would you have the Liberals surging in that region, but in BC, just not really moving at all? But Ontario, they're moving fast. But then Manitoba, Saskatchewan, they're just kind of, sitting there. They're not doing very much, even though you would assume that they'd be higher because of their strength in places like Winnipeg. I can't even tell you what the problem here is. I just want to show you some other polling results from other pollsters now to just demonstrate how wide this variance is right now. And by the way, I think Ecos specifically, Main Street, I think that's just an outlier result in Ontario provincially. Again, the way public opinion shifts is slow. Maybe you could say, it's the Trump tariff thing, and now people are rallying around the flag, which means they're rallying around the Liberal Party. Maybe. I don't quite believe it, even with the speed of it. But you don't have like what is like a 16-point swing in Ontario alone within 11 days or 10 days. That's just not how people actually think about politics. That's just not actually how people react to the news. You have to have an absolute nuclear bomb of a news story hit, some massive corruption scandal hit the Conservatives right when the Liberals have some star candidate rising to be the next prime minister, then maybe I could see there being this much of a shift. But that didn't happen. So when I see this much of a shift, I just assume it's wrong, because that, again, is just not how public opinion works. This is the last Abacus data poll that was released on the 12th of January. A little bit further back, granted, I want something newer, but a lot of newer stuff is just not out right now. But this is what the current Abacus data poll looks like. Ignore the stupid ad on the bottom. I can't get to go away. But they show in Atlantic Canada, the Conservatives at 53%. In Ontario, the Conservatives at 50%. They're even in second place in Quebec, which the Conservatives could take or leave. British Columbia 50, and then in the other provinces, obviously still very, very much ahead. This is where, and I can keep going to different pollsters, and maybe I will just quickly do that. I can keep going to other people's results. And right now, it doesn't seem to make much sense to me that the Liberals would be increasing in these regions where other pollsters show them that they have absolutely no capacity at the moment. This is Nanos's recent national numbers that was released on January 17th. In fact, after the last Main Street one, 45 to 21 and 19 for the NDP. I don't doubt that the Liberals are going to be clawing into the NDP support as they pick a new leader because, oh my goodness, at least it's not Justin Trudeau. Because secretly, Jagmeet Singh is as unpopular inside of his own party as Justin Trudeau was unpopular inside of his party. Jagmeet Singh, we saw it in a recent, I believe it was, might have not been Abacus data. I think it was Abacus data, but they asked voters, do you think that Jagmeet Singh is the right person to be leading the NDP into the next federal election? And those who ranked themselves certain to vote NDP, including the undecideds, 42% said he was the wrong choice, 41% said he was the right choice, and then there were some undecideds. When people are certain to vote for your party, and even those people, more than 50% of the decided people, think you're the wrong choice, that's pathetic. That's really sad. And that's the reason why I actually do think it's realistic to see some sort of a bounce in the near future for the Liberals. I just don't think it's going to be as substantial as this trend line is trying to show. This is just 338 Canada. They're just putting the polls on display. You can see which polls here are ECOS. All three of these little points going upwards quite quickly are ECOS research. Again, I could see the Liberals jumping to 28% or so after some new leader is installed. That again, it's just that Trudeau's gone, the sun's back out for the Liberals, they can be excited. But I think it's going to be a polling mirage that you're not actually going to see that many people truly come home to the Liberal Party because it's still the Liberal Party. Look at any governmental approval ratings for the Liberal government. And yes, that's affected by the fact that Trudeau was the prime minister. But when the government itself, which is basically saying, do you like your own MP? Do you like how government functions outside of the leader? When you're only at 23%, how many people do you have to convince that you're doing a good job? You have to add like 15 points to that to have a base of people that you can win an election with. Because even if people approve of the government, that doesn't even necessarily mean that they're Liberal voters. Might be Green voters, might be the NDP, might be the Bloc, because the Bloc are incentivized to like this government because they're not going to have anything after the next election if the Conservative Party wins a majority. Again, I think that most of these, like the problems are either ECOS. I think Frank Graves is flat out making stuff up. When you look at his data tables, and I've seen them, they make no sense. When I showed you that the Greens were at 12% in Atlantic Canada, that's after he did severe weighting on their polling numbers. That's when he actually adjusted everything down. His original data table showed 18% for the Greens. He showed 10% for, or 11% for the PPC in Atlantic Canada. He showed 12% for the PPC in the prairies, Manitoba and Saskatchewan. That's not real. That's just not real. If you've ever seen PPC by-election results in the past few years, you know that they have not maintained their support at all. You think that they're going to be 12% in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, even though when Maxime Bernier ran in Portage Lisgar himself in 2023, that they lost votes? No, they're not going to suddenly do better. 18%, 12% for the Greens would mean they would win like 5 seats. Elizabeth May and the Greens are not stupid enough to move a bunch of resources into Atlantic Canada over that poll. That poll, which, by the way, only showed the Greens at 2.3% in both Ontario and British Columbia, which is weird because that's where their 2 seats are currently. You think they would do a little bit better where their 2 seats are, especially since those are provinces that also elect provincial Green politicians. Yes, there are some maritime provinces that also elect Green politicians, but the Maritimes has always been a conservative versus liberal battlefield. In fact, the NDP basically doesn't exist in the Maritimes. Find me a province where the NDP can score above 3% of the vote, and I'll eat my hat. I know there probably is one, but Look at New Brunswick. They didn't even exist in that last election. In other elections, they have to like choke somebody out and force them to be the NDP leader because it's embarrassing. Because you're not going to get anything done. You have no support at all. Nobody cares about you. And so that's where I think going forward, are the Liberals going to have a bounce? Sure. I would be skeptical of anyone suddenly putting them above 30%. Because at some point, I think a lot of Canadians had this moment where they just turned off and they're voting Conservative. And that's what we saw from by elections like Cloverdale, Langley City, where the Conservatives literally win by 50%. They have a 50% victory margin. And then you see that also in the by elections like Toronto, St. Paul, where the Conservatives win a downtown Toronto riding, or in LaSalle, Amard Verdun, where the Bloc Québécois win a Liberal seat on blood red Montreal. Yes, Mark Carney might be able to bring it back a bit, but outside of the type of people who are willing to take polls, the average person doesn't care anymore. And that's where you always have to remember with polls. Polls are done with people who will take a poll. People who don't take polls but still vote don't take polls. And they tend to have more generic opinions. People who pick up the phone and take a poll, they tend to be more partisan. That's why ECOS in the 21 election would often put the PPC at 10%, 12%, and this is after weighting's done. They had them at 12%. Frank Graves must be high on glue because no chance the PPC was at 12%. Even at the time when I was voting PPC in 21, I assumed that the PPC were not going to get 12%, but they might be like, maybe 7 or something like that. But the thing is that PPC people will always pick up the phone to tell you that they're voting PPC. They're a very fired up crowd where the average Liberal and Conservative voter isn't. Even the NDP voter tends to be a little bit more rah for their party. So you'll always see the NDP often like coming in severely short of how they poll. 2021, often they were polling 20%, 21%. They come in at 17 because the NDP really doesn't have that much strength in a lot of regions. They put up a lot of paper candidates. That's just kind of their thing. And now I would say the path for victory, because let's get into the path for victory. Before I do that, guys, it's really late in the video, but if you're still watching and you're not yet a subscriber, I assume you like me enough. So guys, like this video, subscribe to the channel, do all that great stuff, trying to get to 100,000 by mid-December. But the path of victory here, I think, for the Conservatives, I'm going to talk about from a policy perspective of what they have to do on policy, and then in terms of the actual ridings and regions. Policy, I think the Conservatives almost have to drop the carbon tax. Refer to it, talk about how they helped basically kill the carbon tax, and even the Liberals agree with them. That's good, but I think this needs to be an immigration election. It needs to be a common sense, rational social policy election. It needs to be an election where they push back against DEI in government, and they push back against like gender theory in schools. They say, I'm not transferring money to any school that's not just teaching reading, writing, arithmetic. It needs to be an anti-crime election. I think the Conservatives have talked about the carbon tax too much at this point, to the point where all the juice out of that thing has been squeezed out. Nobody really wants to talk about the carbon tax anymore. It's like COVID. COVID was so done to death, mostly because of the government locking people down and like mess with people's heads so much, they don't even want to talk about it anymore. I've told people running in Ontario for the New Blue Party, the Doug Ford Ontario PCs were awful on lockdowns. Also, don't bring it up because people just don't want to talk about it. Same thing with the carbon tax. We've talked about the carbon tax for so long. I think every time we say it, you then get stereotyped as having nothing to say. I think the Conservatives need to talk about an across-the-board income tax cut. Run on a 3% across-the-board income tax cut outside of really low income brackets where they're only paying about 8% or 10% at the moment. Maybe you can lower it to like 7%. I don't know. But an across-the-board income and business tax cut, that's what you run on. You run on stuff that people can actually do on the back of a napkin math and realize, oh my goodness, I'll have another $2,100 at the end of the year. Do that, or else you end up being the party who just wants to talk about gas taxes. And that's not a federal issue. That is not a civilizational building issue for a party. I want the Conservatives to win. That's why I'm giving this advice. They need something that feels more like a vision. Being against the carbon tax is not a vision anymore when Justin Trudeau is not on the ballot to vote against for many voters. You need to have a something to vote for, something audacious to vote for. Cutting immigration by 80%, cutting income taxes across the board by 3%, business taxes go down by 3 or 4%. Also, by the way, that's how you beat the US in a trade war if you're going to get into one. You lower your taxes and regulations. You don't even put counter tariffs on them. You outcompete them. You just make sure that people will move their businesses to your side of the border anyways, because your business taxes are only 13%, and even Trump can only offer 15 if you manufacture in the US. That's what you do. And there's no point in putting tariffs up because that means that Canadians are paying more to bring in US goods. You don't hurt your own people in the middle of a trade war. You just make it harder on the other side. If they want to trade into your country, fine. By the way, that builds up some goodwill that you weren't the problem. Anyways, but now regionally, what is the conservative path to victory? I think that the conservatives need to write off Quebec. They're going to pick up another 3 or 4 seats. That's fine. Not much to write home about. Frankly, we could probably pick up almost as many seats by just focusing on the territories, and that's 3 seats at best. We're not going to win Nunavut, though. That's always going to be NDP probably for the next little while. But I think that the Conservatives need to be focusing on Southwest Ontario, cleaning up outside of the GTA seats. They need Northern Ontario. They need to get a lot of the socially conservative voters in the Maritimes out to vote because those voters are very particular. This is why socially conservative issues work in elections. I'm a social conservative. I'm not just saying this because I want people to talk about like life issues and go against gender theory, but Maritime voters are socially conservative, fiscally moderate voters. They're usually not hawkish on cutting taxes and whatnot because they benefit heavily from equalization. So they tend to not really care too much about fiscal responsibility. Not stereotyping everyone. That's just a general voter who doesn't think too hard and just throws a ballot in the ballot box. That person usually is not a fiscal hawk, the way like an Alberta conservative voter is a fiscal hawk, but actually less of a social conservative. So I think for the Conservatives to win, focus on outside of GTA ridings that are flippable, focus on the Maritimes, and then you're going to want to focus on outside of Vancouver and Victoria, BC ridings. If you do that, you will be able to clean up. There are probably some other Manitoba ridings that you can steal from the NDP, as they're showing a lot of weakness with Jagmeet Singh being a listless leader. But overall, do not chase the dream of moderating yourself to winning the GTA. By the way, if you actually want the GTA, you should actually be more conservative. How do you think Ford won it in 2018? Doug Ford is a hack these days, but in 2018, him promising to reform the sex ed curriculum, which he never did, vote New Blue in Ontario's provincial election, my goodness, that actually helped him in a lot of the ridings like in Brampton and Mississauga, because those are SoCon voters. If you run on some common sense social policies, you will do better in the cities. But overall, your more clear path to victory is outside of those major cities. Clean up the suburbs, clean up some of these rural ridings we still don't have in Ontario, and we will be golden. We just need 180 seats, 190 seats. We just need a majority. Do not sacrifice the party brand to try and go for a Hail Mary pass for Montreal. It's not happening. Maybe we get Mount Royal. That was always how it was going to be, even as the worst polling for the Liberals. At best, the Conservatives were going to get two, probably just one in Montreal, clean up around a couple of the suburbs in Beauce and stuff like that, and then, get out of Quebec. Don't focus on it. Legitimately, put some effort into the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. It's worth more to you. By the way, stop letting insiders at the top of the party kick people out of nominations, like myself in Signal Hill, because guess what? You're going to tick off a lot of people's volunteers, and they're not going to help on the federal election. So remember that, because as we're trying to build a movement, you don't want to be throwing people out of the bus thinking that we're so far ahead we can afford to do it. Because those people who were good candidates, who were going to win unless they were kicked out of nominations, were your best volunteers. They were your best, hardest working people, by the way. Anyways, so that's it for me today, guys. Remember to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Actually, not tomorrow. I'll probably make another video today. I'll see you guys later.